Welcome to Lives Beneath History. In the 10th century, across the vast desert routes that connected the salt mines of the Sahara to the gold markets of the south, a merchant named Yusuf ibn Harun moved his caravan through heat and silence, carrying wealth measured in stone. He was not a man of armies or courts, but of ledgers and rope and the careful management of trust across impossible distances. This is his story. Yusuf ibn Harun felt the salt before he saw it. He pressed his palm flat against the nearest slab, still bound in its rope cradle across the camel's flank. And the surface was cool in the way that stone held coolness just before dawn broke the night apart. The slab was perhaps 2 handspans thick, and as long as a man's torso. It had been cut from the mines at Tagaza 6 weeks ago, and already the edges had begun to soften from the dry air and the friction of travel. He ran a thumb along one corner, and the white powder came away on his skin. A good slab held its shape for the crossing. One that crumbled early was a loss he could not recover through argument or prayer. He wiped his hand on his robe and turned to count the rest of the line. 43 camels carrying salt, 4 more carrying food, water skins, and the tools of a merchant's trade. His assistant, a young man named Kazim, whose father had worked for Yusuf's own father before him, stood near the rear of the column, checking the knotwork on the rope cradles. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon, but the sky was already losing its darkness, going from deep black to a gray that promised heat. Yusuf had been on this route 11 times. He knew how quickly the gray turned to white, and then to something that pressed down on a man's shoulders like a wet cloth over the face. He went to his own camel and checked the animal's feet, one by one, lifting each in turn, looking for cracking in the pad or any sign of stone bruising. The camel endured this without protest, which was itself a kind of information. An animal in pain found ways to tell you. He released the last foot and stood straight and looked north along the route they had come from, and then south along the route they would travel. The desert in both directions looked the same. That was the first lesson of the crossing. Direction was a decision you made with your mind, not something the land offered to you. Yusuf had learned his star reading from an old man in Sajila Mesa who had crossed the Sahara more than 20 times in his life and who carried in his head the positions of the stars, the way another man might carry the layout of a city he had grown up in. The old man, whose name was Ibrahim al-Maki, had told him once that the desert did not kill men who made good decisions. It killed men who stopped making decisions and waited instead for something outside themselves to resolve what they faced. Yusuf had not fully understood this at 20. At 38, with salt dust in the creases of his neck and the ache of old saddle hours in his lower back, he understood it well enough. The caravan that season was not his alone. This was the arrangement that troubled him. He had partnered with 2 other merchants for the crossing, a man named Daud ibn Salim, who operated out of Tlemcen, and who had put 11 camels worth of salt into the column, and a man named Rashid al-Waziri from Fez, who had contributed 9 camels. The remaining animals and their loads were Yusuf's. The agreement had been written and witnessed in Sijil Masa before departure, in the presence of a notary whose seal Yusuf trusted. The division of costs for water and guides and the hired men who walked beside the column was proportional to each merchant's stake in the cargo. The division of profit at the southern markets would follow the same proportion. This was a standard arrangement. Yusuf had entered into partnerships before. He preferred to travel alone, but the route south that year had been disrupted by conflict between 2 communities, whose grazing boundaries had become a source of violence, and the desert guide he respected most had refused to take a small party through the affected region. A larger caravan commanded more attention and, if necessary, more ability to move through contested territory without appearing to be worth attacking. So he had made the arrangement with Daud and Rashid. He had accepted the logic of it. What he had not anticipated, or had anticipated only as a distant possibility, was the question that had begun forming in the back of his mind some 10 days into the crossing. It had started with a count. Every 3 days, Yusuf counted the salt slabs on his own camels, which was standard practice. A slab could shift and fall in the night without any man noticing until morning. A count gave you early information. On the 10th day of travel, he had counted 41 slabs where there should have been 43. He counted again. 41. He said nothing immediately. He walked the line of his own animals twice and found no evidence of rope failure, no trace of a slab having fallen and shattered on the ground. He checked the tracks behind the column that morning, walking back along the route for a distance before the wind and the disturbance of the caravans passage made reading the ground too difficult. He found nothing conclusive. The loss of 2 slabs from a load of 43 was within the range of what could happen on a long crossing. Ropes failed. Slabs fell in the dark. He had noted the discrepancy in his own small record book, a bound set of folded pages he kept wrapped in oiled cloth against his body, and he had continued. But on the 16th day he had counted again and found 40 slabs, 1 more gone. He thought about this in the way he thought about most commercial problems, by listing what he knew with certainty and what he only suspected, and then by considering which explanation was cheapest in terms of what it required him to believe. The cheapest explanation was accident. Rope failure in the night, a slab lost somewhere on the route, the loss undiscovered because no one had been watching at the moment it happened. This was possible. It had happened to him once before on an earlier crossing, and he had found the shattered remains some distance back along the track when he sent a man to search. The more expensive explanation, in terms of what it required him to believe about the people around him, was that someone in the column was removing salt, not stealing in the ordinary sense of taking something for personal use. Salt slabs this size had no use to a hired man on a desert crossing, but they had value, and value could be converted. If a man removed a slab and passed it to another party, or buried it along the route for retrieval, or traded it for something in one of the small encampments they passed near, then the slab became something else entirely. Yusuf had no direct evidence of this. What he had was a discrepancy in his count and a feeling that had settled into his chest over the last several days. The feeling of a man who suspects something but cannot yet afford to act on suspicion alone. The column included, beyond himself and Qasim and the 2 partner merchants, 11 hired men who walked beside the camels and managed the animals and made the camp each evening. These men had been contracted in Sijil Masa, and their wages were recorded and their names were known. Yusuf had used 3 of them on previous crossings. The others were new to him. One of the new men, a man called Merjan, who was heavy through the shoulders and walked with a slight forward lean, as though always fighting wind, had come with a recommendation from Rashid al-Waziri. This was not in itself suspicious. Merchants recommended men they trusted to other merchants. But Yusuf noticed that Merjan spent his rest periods near the sections of the column that carried Yusuf's salt specifically, not distributed across the length of the line the way the other hired men positioned themselves. He noticed this the way a merchant noticed things, without drawing attention to the noticing, filing the observation away alongside the count discrepancies. He did not mention his suspicions to Daoud or Rashid. This required some justification in his own mind. Both men were his partners in the crossing, and both had an interest in the integrity of the cargo. If salt was being removed from Yusuf's portion of the column, his partners might reasonably be expected to want to know. But the situation was not so clean. Rashid had recommended Merjan. That did not make Rashid responsible for whatever Merjan might be doing, but it created a complication. If Yusuf accused Merjan openly and was wrong, he had damaged the reputation of a man Rashid had vouched for, and he had damaged his own relationship with a partner he needed for the remainder of the crossing. If he was right, then Rashid would face the question of whether he had known. These were not abstract concerns. Yusuf had seen partnerships dissolved over accusations made without sufficient evidence, and the dissolution of a partnership mid-crossing was a practical disaster of the first order. The guide, a man named Ahmad, who had been navigating this route for 15 years, and who communicated mostly through the economy of someone who had learned that words cost water, had told them that morning that they were perhaps 9 days from the first southern market. 9 days was a long time. It was also short enough that Yusuf could see the end of the problem from where he stood. What he needed to decide was whether to act before they arrived, or to wait and address the question of the missing slabs once they were in a settled place, with witnesses and a structure for dispute resolution that he could trust. The Islamic commercial law that governed his transactions was clear on certain points and less clear on others. A merchant who could demonstrate loss was entitled to seek remedy. The difficulty was demonstration. His count was his own record, written in his own hand. It was evidence of something, but not, by itself, proof of theft. He needed either to catch Merchant in the act, which would require watching him continuously and with care, or to find the missing slabs, which might or might not be possible, or to arrive at the southern market with whatever remained of his load and then pursue the matter through the mechanisms available to him there. He remembered a dispute his father had been involved in decades before, when Yusuf was perhaps 12 years old and had accompanied his father on a shorter trading journey to the north. One of the other merchants in that caravan had accused a hired man of taking cloth. His father had listened to the accusation and then said to the man making it, "What you believe and what you can show are not the same weight." The cloth merchant had not had enough to show. The dispute had ended badly for him, not because he was dishonest, but because he had moved from suspicion to accusation before the gap between them was bridged by evidence. Yusuf's father had not told him this to make him cautious about wrongdoing. He had told him this to make him careful about the moment of accusation, which was the point at which a private trouble became a public one and acquired a shape that could no longer be easily changed. That evening, Yusuf asked Qasim quietly to begin sleeping near the salt lines at night rather than with the other men at the main fire. He gave a practical reason. The ropes needed checking in the cold hours when the temperature drop caused the material to contract. This was true. It was also true that a man sleeping near the line was a man who would notice if another man came to the camels in the dark. Qasim was not a young man anymore, 24 and steady, and he understood, without being told, that there was more to the instruction than rope management. He nodded and asked no questions, and that evening arranged his sleeping mat near the rear of Yusuf's section of the column without making a show of it. Yusuf lay awake longer than usual that night, listening to the desert settle into its nighttime sounds. The small adjustments of the camels, the distant sound of something moving far off in the dark, the wind pulling at the edges of the cloth shelter he had pitched against his saddle. He thought about salt. He had been thinking about salt since he was old enough to understand what his father did for a living. Salt cut from the ground in slabs that a man could carry. Salt traded across hundreds of miles of some of the most difficult terrain on earth. Salt weighed against gold dust at the southern markets, measured and bargained over and recorded in account books that represented years of accumulated trust between merchants who would never see each other's faces. The whole structure of it depended on the integrity of individual transactions, on each man in the chain doing what he had agreed to do and not doing what he had not agreed to do. This was not a romantic idea to Yusuf. It was a commercial observation. Trust was not a virtue in the abstract. It was the mechanism by which trade across long distances operated. When it broke, the costs were concrete and spread across many people who had not been party to the original breach. He slept eventually, and in the morning Qasim told him quietly that nothing had moved in the night. Yusuf received this information without visible reaction and went to count his slabs, 40, unchanged. He wrote the number in his book and folded the pages back into their cloth wrapping and returned them to their place against his body. The guide Ahmed called the column to movement before the sun cleared the horizon. Yusuf took his position near the front of his section of the line. Merchant was somewhere behind him, doing the work he was contracted to do, managing the animals and keeping pace, and being, in all observable respects, a hired man on a desert crossing. Whether he was also something else, Yusuf did not yet know with certainty. What he knew was this: he had 8 more days on this route. He had a count that concerned him, and a suspicion he had not yet acted on, and a partner who had recommended a man he was watching. He had a decision to make, and he would make it carefully, because making it badly would cost him more than the slabs already gone. He walked forward with the column as the sky went from gray to white above the desert floor, and the day's heat began to build in the way it always did, steadily and without mercy, and the camels moved in their slow, reliable rhythm, and the salt on their flanks caught the early light and for a moment appeared to glow before the sun rose fully, and the brightness of the desert swallowed everything into its uniform glare. The great empires of his age left their names in the records of scholars and the accounts of travelers who passed through their capitals. Yusuf ibn Harun left no such record. And yet the trade he carried out, repeated by thousands of men like him across generations, was the mechanism by which those empires held their weight. Salt moved south, gold moved north. The markets of two worlds were joined not by conquest or decree, but by the quiet decisions of merchants who knew how to read the stars and how to count their losses and how to continue regardless. History tends to remember the rulers who taxed that trade and forgets the men who made it possible. Yusuf was one of those men. Thank you for listening to Lives Beneath History.